Hello. Today we're going to talk a little bit about monopoly, which is one of the things in microeconomics. It's a lot of fun to talk about. It's controversial, and a lot of people have strong opinions about monopoly behavior in a free market economy. First off, let's try to define a monopoly and get an idea of what we're talking about. A monopoly is just a single firm that has the whole demand curve to itself. Um, in addition to that, there's got to be no easy entry for a competing firm. So the firm that has the demand curve all to itself has that for a while before entry can compete that away, and for that reason, it has a monopoly power. Now, monopolies are despised by many people. We hear negative things thrown about all the time about monopoly behavior and people who sort of use their bully kind of pushiness in the market to take advantage of consumers and do things that are socially undesirable. So let's talk about that for a few minutes and find out kind of how a monopoly works. Well, first of all, I said the monopolist has the demand curve entirely to itself. And by that, I mean that it can set price or it can set quantity, but it can't set both at the same time because it has to be constrained by that demand curve, which shows people's willingness and ability to pay for a good or a service. So if it wants to raise price, it can do that in many cases, but it's going to lose sales. And conversely, if it wants to lower price, again, it's free to do that, and it will gain sales if it does that. So the monopolist has to decide which one of those pieces of the demand curve it's going to sell on and what price quantity combination is the one that it wants. How does it decide that? Well, again, we look at the cost of doing business. We look at the cost, particularly the marginal costs in the short run of doing business, and we set that equal to the marginal revenue of the firm. And we use that law that we've talked about many times before. MC equals MR will give us an intersection that will show us the proper quantity for the monopolist to maximize profits. Now, there's no assurance that he's going to make profits to begin with. It may be that the demand curve is insufficient to really support all the cost of production, and in that case, the monopolist goes out of business. So many times monopolists perish just because the demand for their product is not enough. So again, we're thinking of a situation where the monopolist is trying to maximize profits. It does that using the MC equals MR rule. That's how it sets output and price, and that would be its short-run optimization solution. Now, how do these monopolies emerge? Interestingly, there's all kinds of reasons why a monopoly might come about. One of the reasons they come about is because they have some kind of key input that nobody else can have equal access to. For example, if you're near a gold mine and gold is produced relatively few places in the world, diamond similarly produced relatively few places in the world. If you happen to have an access to that source of supply, you can find yourself in a monopolist position. Similarly, patents give people monopoly power. If you patent a drug or if you patent a machine or you patent anything, you have intellectual property rights to that, which means that you're the only one by law that can produce that until the patent expires, and that gives you the full reign of the demand curve over that piece of time. Another way the monopoly can emerge is because the government wants it to emerge. It can protect it from foreign trade, which gives it a protected position in the domestic economy. Or sometimes the government just likes a business, like the National Football League or the NCAA, and it gives it particular powers, and it protects it from competition, and it allows it to do things that a monopolist would be allowed to do. One final kind of monopoly is a natural monopoly, and those we've talked about a little bit before. Natural monopolies emerge when the cost curve slopes downward through the relevant piece of the demand curve, and that's another way of saying as the monopolist produces more, the average cost falls, and so we want that monopolist to produce more and have less competition, so that prices fall for the consumer. And this is what we see oftentimes in the natural utility sector, the public utility sector, where we have the water company, the electric company, and other utilities like that that have what we consider to be a natural monopoly. So there are some monopolies we consider to be very favorable. The government likes them, consumers like them, and then some that we consider to be pernicious and we think that we need to get in and do something about those. For a minute, let's look at remedies to the monopoly situation. There's been a lot of efforts in U.S. history to reduce the influence of monopolies. This really started out in the late 1800s when we had the trust busting movement in the U.S. around 1890. And a major piece of legislation came out of that that was called the Sherman Act of 1890. And we called monopolies trusts back in those days. And one of the big ones that we were worried about was the oil trust and the railroad trust. And the idea was that we've got to get in there and regulate them because they've got too big of an advantage over the consumer. And of course, that's when the Sherman Act was created. The essence of the Sherman Act was to prevent restraint of trade. And basically, it says we like competition. Adam Smith liked competition. We think competition is good. And if we feel like a company is not competitive, then we want to get in there and change the rules of the game a little bit to give the consumer a little bit more clout in the contract. And so that was the essence of the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act didn't quite have the legal clout that lawmakers wanted it to have. So in 1914, a companion piece of legislation called the Clayton Act came about, and it strengthened the provisions of the Sherman Act. There have been a lot of antitrust movements since then. You hear about it recently in the Microsoft case not too long ago. The NCAA case is being heard now, and there's oftentimes situations where antitrust is in the news. So it's an issue that's still with us today. As we sort of finish up today, I want you to think of one common strategy, or one maybe it's not so common strategy, but one useful strategy to think about when we're studying monopolies. And that is a lot of these monopolies go away on their own. Demand shifts, people decide to get interested in a different product, and all of a sudden the monopoly that was so powerful at one time has lost all of its clout. Many of you remember Beanie Babies, and I think that's a good example of a monopolist that went away just on its own. When it had monopoly clout back in maybe around 2000, it was selling a lot of Beanie Babies at relatively high prices, and then the demand curve changed, and all of a sudden, that monopolist who had a piece of that market that was unique and was not really susceptible to a lot of competition, it faded away over time. And that's not an uncommon thing. So when we think about monopolies, sometimes we don't need to be hasty about it. We can say, will this monopoly go away if we just stand back and watch the economic landscape change? So there's a lot of good things, a lot of timely issues, a lot of important theory that comes around in economics of monopoly.